Welcome back, everyone. Our next speaker is Stijn Alsteins, who is the director of the Fondation Custodia, the collection Fritz Lucht in Paris, although I think is known to almost everyone in this room from his previous stints as head of Old Master Drawings at Christie's, and before that, a curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art from 2006 to 16. Way back in 2008, he was the curator of an exhibition on Lambert Domer and Dutch views of France. And given that one of the central themes of the exhibition, Far and Away, is the travels of Dutch artists, we thought we would call him back to return to that topic. And he does so today in a talk entitled Poetry and Truth in Lambert Domer's French Views.
Thank you, John, to you and to your colleagues, and also to Chips for inviting me here and uniting us all around Dutch drawings. In 1932, Karel Čapek, the Czech writer who invented the word robot, published his impressions of a trip to the Netherlands under the title Pictures from Holland. As so many visitors to the country, he paid particular attention to the art and architecture of the country's past. Quote, alongside the real Holland, he wrote in his book, there is also the so-called Old Holland. But please don't confuse them. The real Holland is, for the most part, old. The Old Holland, for the most part, is not real. Čapek's words stand as a useful warning when looking at the works of 17th century Dutch art. A case in point is Lambert Domer, an Amsterdam draftsman and painter, represented in the exhibition of Chip's Mo's collection, currently on view here, with a panorama of Paris, seen from the heights of Montmartre, to which I will return in a moment. Domer, who was born in Amsterdam in 1624 as the son of a frame and cabinet maker called Harman, or Herman, and known early on as Rembrandt's frame maker. The elder Domer and the great painter, Rembrandt, were friends, or at least well acquainted, as evident, among other things, from this, one of the great Rembrandts of the Metropolitan Museum. Although it is far from certain that Lambert was a student of his father's portraitist, many of his drawings bear the undeniable stamp of Rembrandt's example, as in this dusky landscape in my institution of the surroundings of the city of Alkmaar, where Domer settled towards the end of his life. Drawings and prints by Rembrandt, such as this famous etched view of the Diemersdijk near Amsterdam, are obvious comparisons for Domer's drawing. From two inventories of Domer's possessions, we know that he also had an extensive collection of paintings, drawings, and prints by Rembrandt, and it is possible that he was influenced not directly by Rembrandt's teaching, but by looking at the works by the Leiden master he was able to acquire for himself. Still in his 20s, in 1645, Domer set off from Amsterdam to France, traveling over the Isle of Wight in the English Channel. Two of his brothers were part of the thriving community of Dutch wine merchants in Nantes, the city on the Loire estuary, where Domer was joined in May 1646 by his travel companion, an even younger fellow artist named Willem Schellings. We are exceptionally well informed about that trip because of the journal Schellings kept and which survived, as well as by the many drawings by Domer related to their travels along the Loire. The beautiful sheet on the screen, uptown at the Metropolitan, shows a traveler, perhaps fresh off a boat downstream the Loire, walking towards the city from the west. Conveniently, Domer inscribed many of his drawings on their back with an indication of the site depicted, as he did here in slightly truncated form at lower right, the Stad Nantes van de Hermitage, or the city of Nantes seen from the Hermitage. Here you can recognize the word Nantes in typical 17th century Dutch handwriting. The Hermitage was, by the way, a popular rocky viewpoint which served as a repoussoir along the left edge of the drawing, as you can see. Domer's drawings and Schellings' diary, of which Hans Beurs and I published an edition with a French translation in 2008, allow us to follow their trip along the river up to Orléans from where they travel to Paris. That the French capital is depicted in Chipsmore's drawing here on the screen can be doubted. Not only did Dormer remark on the back, aldus vertoont zich Parijs van Montmartre te zien, thus looks Paris seen from Montmartre. The large building at center, without any doubt, depicts the Notre Dame, of which the profile has not been altered much despite centuries of neglect, its 19th century restoration by Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, and its most recent, nearly finished restoration following the disastrous fire in April 2019. This is, of course, the Notre Dame. Some other elements of the skyline as drawn by Dormer can be recognized, such as the Tower of the Temple. I'm not seeing very clearly, I think it's here. The Tower of the Temple, the Parisian fortress of the Knights Templar, destroyed after the royal family was imprisoned there after the French Revolution, or the many windmills in the foreground, characteristic of the rural area then as now known as Montmartre. And anyone familiar with the paintings of the French Impressionists or Vincent van Gogh will have seen these windmills or similar windmills in their 19th century form, and perhaps some of you may have been tempted to spend an evening at the Moulin Rouge also in Montmartre. Otherwise, Dormer's view of Paris seems to take a lot of liberties with reality, as he would have known it when Schelling-Saint-Guy explored the surroundings of the city in August 1646. None of the other churches, as far as I know, or other buildings actually correspond to real buildings. Given the career Dormer built for himself as a topographical draftsman who was able to produce original work, the lack of accuracy in the Paris view may surprise. Dormer traveled extensively, not only in Holland and France, but also during a trip in the early 1660s in Germany, where his father, the cabinet maker, hailed from. Drawings made on the spot during his travels, such as this view of Mönchengladbach along the Rhine, are generally made in black chalk, heightened with the gray and brownish washes which add atmosphere to Dormer's drawings. The sketches made in France are often smaller in size and even more rudimentary, such as this recently discovered sheet of a well near Nantes, identifiable again thanks to Dormer's inscription on the back and dated 1645, so among the earliest drawings known from the trip. Some drawings brought back from France must have been somewhat more elaborate, such as this view of an inn near Nantes, on which Dormer later based a painting as appealing as it is formally plain. Dormer's French views give us his very personal vision of the country he was visiting, unofficial, often rural and poor, more le nain than le brun. As Schelling's diary details, Dormer and his fellow travelers were less interested in the chateaux along the Loire or in the grandeur of the past than in what seemed curious and odd to them in the cities, the countryside, and the population's Catholic habits. At some time after his return to Antwerp, Dormer started making replicas based on his travel sketches. Those executed in a lively pen style reminiscent of Rembrandt and enhanced with Dormer's characteristic washes must date from relatively soon after the artist's return to Holland. In the drawing shown here, a group of men are playing a sport known as the jeu de longue paume, a variant of court tennis, near the walls of the castle in the city of Saumur. That Dormer made such replicas points to the interest of Dutch collectors to discover the world beyond Holland without actually having to leave their country. Dormer's travel sketches represented a capital unavailable to many of his fellow artists, which he sought to exploit for many decades. In fact, in some cases, others borrowed Dormer's views, such as Willem Schellings, who must have based this drawing on the one just shown before by Dormer. The largest number of Dormer's replicas can be dated to the early 1670s for reasons I won't go into here, and can easily be recognized thanks to the ledger paper on which Dormer drew them. You can recognize that paper by the lines which do I do this right? No. Which run along the upper edge of the paper, so paper produced as ledger paper. Notice the parallel lines at the top of the sheets, which have become or remained visible through the washes depicting the sky, and also the large cinemascope format, which makes these drawings so well adapted to the projection screen. The series, because the replicas from this period seem to have been made for one single collector, span not only the French strip, but also that in Germany, as well as places in the Dutch Republic as seen here. And they all appear in the sale of the Amsterdam collection of Hieronymus Tonneman in 1754, who may have acquired them earlier in the 18th century from their first owner, who, I am being very cautious here, may have commissioned the series from Dormer. When working on the series, Dormer would have had to go back to earlier drawings, in particular to his travel sketches. He would not have had much else to go to and would have had to rely on material that was not necessarily detailed enough or adapted to the format of the series. In some cases, he may have wanted to add an entire view, which he had not recorded in 1646, and this may well be the case with the sole drawing of Paris, which is more official and representative than any view in the series on ledger paper. Dormer may simply not have drawn Paris in a usable way during its trip in 1646, but may have wanted to add it to the series in the 1670s for completeness. As has been suggested before, he may have turned to an available view of the city, prints, for instance, such as Matthias Merian's The Elder, well-known engraving. Whatever model Dormer used, he seems not to have copied it slavishly, but included some of the city's most recognizable features while inventing other parts of the city, resulting in the plausible, just about recognizable, but also not really accurate portrait of the city, as discussed before. The view of Paris cannot be called an imaginary view, however, but Dormer produced those as well. Sorry. Well, I missed an image, but that's okay. Dormer produced those as well, such as this obvious example, which I can't show you, I'm sorry, a drawing in Leiden, which is dated 69. On the back of the drawing, he did not add an inscription to identify the site, although he did use motifs from the French strip, in particular a long bridge, the Pont de l'Échellerie in Nantes, recorded in several drawings by Dormer and in one by Schellings. And the juxtaposition of the topographical motif of the bridge with the mountains in the background, I'm sorry, again, you can't see it, pretty quickly give the view away as imaginary, a little bit as in the case of the Jan van der Velde drawing Rob just showed. But Dormer's views offer occasionally a more subtle fantasy. I'm sorry, I think the images are jumbled, so I will have to jump from one to the other. Dormer's views offer occasionally a more subtle fantasy, a mix of truth and poetry, of various realities assembled into a picturesque whole. Because so many of the views he recorded are not well documented or depicted by others, it is not always possible to recognize them as partly invented. But at least in a few cases, it is possible to reveal his occasional subterfuge. In his inscription on the verso of this drawing, Dormer claims which is from the series on ledger paper, claims it depicts one of the numerous Renaissance fountains for which the city of Tours was renowned. It corresponds to the 16th century description of the Fontaine de Saint-Étienne, also known as the Belle Fontaine, the beautiful fountain, a description also detailed enough to mention the royal fleur de lis in the sculpted decoration. Right. Is this still working? Right here. Dormer described the drawing subject simply as un port en fontaine de Tours, a gate and a fountain in Tours. There would be no reason to distrust Dormer's inscription on the previous drawing, if not for the existence of quite a different view of the same fountain, shown on the screen here. While the fountain itself is identical in every detail, its surroundings are entirely different. The building behind it, the stairs to its right, the absence of the city gate. The drawing, which is dated 1691 and belongs to the very last works produced by Dormer, who died in 1700. The drawing also bears an inscription by the artist, simply giving its subject as a fountain in Tours. The little turret, this one here, is of a type seen elsewhere in and around the city the city on the Loire, which housed and protected the sophisticated technical installation of the city's water distribution system. But the stairs look suspiciously like those of an Amsterdam hospital, recorded by Dormer in another drawing, and the tower behind the fountain, with its asymmetrical roof, and the wall with niches and a statue in the central one, are in fact those of a city gate in Enkhuizen, a city in North Holland. Sorry, I have to, as you see here, especially the roof can be recognized, the image is truncated, but can be recognized here with here the niches and the statue. Dormer himself drew this gate, sorry, this one, the Oude Keetpoort in this drawing, which dates from 1691. And the drawing from 1691, this one is thus an imaginary cityscape, a deft blend of real places to create an invented one. Sorry, I need to, no. One could be tempted to conclude that the first view, this one of the Belle Fontaine, the one on ledger paper, must be the accurate representation of the fountain and its direct site within Tours. However, the city gate to its left and the modest houses that can be seen throughout it, including these details here, are the same as on a sketch possibly made from life in black chalk, which is identified by Dormer as representing a city gate in Arnhem, in the eastern part of the Netherlands. So neither of Dormer's views of the Belle Fontaine are entirely truthful. Both include elements of drawings made in Dutch cities, which Dormer used to enhance the lost sketch made in France in 1646 of the Belle Fontaine. And there is it coming? There is a third drawing of the fountain in the little-known collection of old master drawings at Museum Kollermüller in Otterlo that can now easily be recognized, unmasked, I should say, as a reworked counterproof of one of the versions discussed earlier. I suspect Dormer used this method of embellishing his French views, working them out into larger, more complete compositions years after his visit to France. I suspect used it much more often than we can identify today. In at least one other case, it is clear he did. This pair of drawings in Haarlem and Rotterdam, both depicting another fountain of Tours, according to Dormer's autograph inscriptions. The Fontaine du Grand Marché is quite precisely drawn, and it is the only record of its appearance today. It is clear, however, that its surroundings, the fountain's surroundings, must have been different than those in either view. The hills behind, in the drawing at left, are more likely those of the rocky shores of the Loire observed elsewhere during Dormer's trip, and the drawing at right, with its more plausibly looking town square, is in fact drawn around another counterproof of the fountain in the drawing at left, making it likely that the houses behind it are in fact not those of Tours' Grand Marché, the town's marketplace. As in the view of Paris in the Moore collection, Dormer must have wanted, decades after he visited France, to offer the collectors interested in original views of the French kingdom something truly original, but also something that only partly is what his inscriptions purport them to be. They speak as much to the Dutch public's hunger for visual information about a world beyond its own borders as to Dormer's willingness to alter, tweak, and enrich reality as he recorded it, often long before the more complete views were made. That 17th century Dutch realism, whether in landscape or genre scenes, was as often as not an illusion is certainly not a new finding. Dormer is not the only artist who has been caught cheating, although the strongly topographical character of much of his oeuvre and the explicit identifications of the sites in his inscriptions make the liberties he took especially surprising. Others did so too, as evident from this drawing, which my institution recently acquired from a German collection, a work by the landscapist Jan Vincentzoon van der Vinne. You can see some drawings by his father in the exhibition upstairs, both members of a family of 17th and 18th century landscapists. Van der Vinne identified this sign drawing on the back as a view of Exeter, very much in the way Dormer did. Exeter, of course, the English city famous for its massive Gothic cathedral, which the artist must have seen when he traveled in England as a young man in the late 1680s. But rather than a precise view, the drawing is more a general impression of the city surrounded by the Devon countryside, just as the Paris view in the Moore collection by Dormer. As remarked in the Sotheby's auction catalog in which this drawing appeared in 2002, the drawing was not itself made naar het leven, from life, but was executed in the studio, maybe even long after the artist had returned to Holland, on the basis of a much slighter and less detailed sketch made on the spot, end quote. English views by Dutch artists undoubtedly offer as rich and as occasionally deceiving an impression of the country as the French views of Dormer do, as the French views of Dormer, Schellings, and others do. But I'd better let the next speaker explore that subject. Thank you.
Our final talk today is by Greg Rubinstein, who's been head of Old Master and Early British Drawings at Sotheby's, London, since 1983. He joked this morning that that's his day job, and he occasionally moonlights as a scholar of Dutch drawings. And he's written on artists including Levens and Seabrook's, both of whom spent time in England. So given the arc of our show and of today's papers, from the Netherlands to Italy to France, we now turn to England as Greg talks to us about Albion seen through orange-tinted spectacles, drawings of 17th century Britain by artists from the Low Countries. Greg.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you very much also to everyone here at the Morgan for organising this wonderful day, and thank you to Chips for giving us the excuse for being here and for allowing us to share the wonderful collection of drawings that he's put together, which is such a joy. It pains me as a loyal Englishman to admit it, but the story of art produced in Britain during the 17th century is very largely that of the art produced by foreign artists working in Britain. With the exception of one or two specialized areas such as miniature painting, the proportion of native artists of real talent and accomplishment was extremely limited until the very end of the 17th century. Yes, of course, there are exceptions, artists such as Nicholas Hilliard, Samuel Cooper, William Dobson, Mary Beale, and so on. But essentially, the story that we're trying to tell when we look at 17th century English art is that of which artists came to England, how long did they stay, what did they produce in England, and how did the patterns of production differ from what was going on at the same time back home. And by back home, we do generally mean the Low Countries, because that is where most of the immigrant artists who came to Britain in the 17th century originated from. And different those patterns were. Especially when one considers the earlier part of the 17th century, studies in the past have tended to focus more on portraiture and history painting than on landscape, reflecting what patrons and the market seem to have wanted in earlier 17th century Britain, and the resulting specialities of the leading artists who came to work there. For example, Rubens, Van Dyck, Gentileschi, Honthorst, Lely, and so on. But what I want to talk about today is landscape, and in particular, of course, drawings. And we're going to take a look at some of the most interesting landscape drawings produced in England by artists from the Low Countries during the long 17th century, in other words, from the latter part of the 16th century through to the very beginning of the 18th century. What types of information can we turn to establish who came and what they did when they were in England? First of all, there's archival and documentary evidence, quite a lot of that, guild records, church records, passports, letters, diaries, and so on. Then there are published second-hand accounts provided by near-contemporary authors in treatises and compendia of biographies, and some of those are not far from being first-hand accounts. So the earliest of those accounts, published by Joachim van Sandrart, he in fact came to England himself in 1627 with Honthorst as a young man, so obviously some of his information was gathered firsthand. Or, for example, Arnold Houbraker, another author who documents the activities of foreign artists in Britain, was a pupil of Hoogstraten, who was in England for several years in the 1660s. But all the same, that doesn't mean we have to trust absolutely everything that we read in these treatises. Maybe we have to question the reference that George Virtue made, for example, that he had spoken to the artist Marcellus Laroon, and Laroon said that he had met Rembrandt once in Hull. It's not impossible, but maybe we should treat it with caution. But in terms of the evidence, perhaps the most important category for our purposes is the actual surviving visual material. And we're going to focus, of course, on drawings, but one has to look a bit at paintings and prints as well, so please forgive me for doing that. Together, these sources provide a wealth of information, but we should also be aware of some potential pitfalls and challenges in interpreting this information. First of all, there's the challenge of correctly identifying artists whose names appear in the records. For example, there are archival records from 1627 to 28 of an artist named Vrome, or young Vrome, working in England. And that, together with the fact that drawings such as the wonderful one in the Moore collection, which we've admired upstairs, do look kind of English in terms of the landscape, has led to the conclusion that it was Cornelis Vrome who was the artist who came to England. But more recent studies actually suggest it was probably his younger brother Frederick instead. Then we have the thorny question of erratic survival, a problem that plagues all aspects of drawings research, and the fact that we have, it seems, no surviving English period works for quite a number of artists who actually worked there for some time. I'm going to come back to this with specific examples shortly. Sometimes we have absolutely no idea what's been lost. Sometimes we have tantalizing clues. For example, there's a reference in a 19th century biography of the courtier Balthazar Gerbier, who worked in London in the retinue of the Duke of Buckingham from 1616 onwards, stating that he had a purpose-built room intended for exhibitions of landscapes in the manner of panoramas. No record of anything like that survives, and it's a fascinating idea that in early 17th century London there should have been such a room, but we have absolutely no idea what was ever in it, what sort of paintings or drawings or panoramas would have been shown in such a context. Another issue we have to contend with is that of whether drawings that clearly depict English views are actually original drawings made on the spot or are copies, possibly by other hands or later repetitions of the type that Stein has been describing. And also the associated question of the actual attribution of drawings, something that some of us spend quite a lot of time thinking about. So, for example, in the recently rediscovered album of 130 drawings by Abraham Rutgers, there are 5 sheets annotated on the back with inscriptions indicating that these are views of Tunbridge in Kent. But does that mean that Rutgers himself made a quick trip over to Kent at some point, or are they copied after prototypes by someone else, possibly his friend Jacob Esselens, who we know did work in England. There are copies after other artists in this Fritz's compendium, but we don't have any prototypes of Esselin's drawings of Tunbridge, so that remains absolutely an unresolved question. Or what should we make of the 4 drawings, of which I show you 3 here, which have historically been attributed to Rembrandt, which show locations in England? The attribution has obviously been discussed a fair amount in more recent times, and not so many of most recent scholars actually consider them to be by Rembrandt himself, though not everybody says they're not. And to be honest, the signatures on a couple of them do look pretty good. But be that as it may, they weren't, it seems, drawn on the spot, and as has often been pointed out in the past, for example, the view of London seen from the north with Old St. Paul's on the bottom of the screen in the Albertina, when you look closely, the tower, the crossing tower of the cathedral doesn't actually sit at the right angle on the crossing. It's sort of 45 degrees off, which indicates fairly clearly that this wasn't a drawing made on the spot. But let's stop talking about what we don't know. We do know from all the various sources that I've mentioned that at least 300 Dutch and Flemish painters, draftsmen, and engravers came to England during the 17th century. And at least 100 of those were active in some way or other as landscapists. One of the earliest known references to landscape as a genre is in fact to be found in Henry Peacham's pioneering 1606 theoretical treatise, The Art of Drawing with the Pen and Limning in Watercolours, where the author wrote, "Seldom is it drawn by itself," implying that landscape generally served merely as the background and setting for other subject matters. But if one includes topographically specific views within the category of landscape, then Peacham's assertion is very clearly incorrect. Topographical landscapes constitute a very significant element in British art from the 16th century onwards, and are going to be at the heart of what we look at and discuss here today. Some of the earliest significant drawings of this type are the important group of large views of English palaces, now in the Ashmolean Museum, which were drawn by Antonis van den Wijngaard, who came to England in 1558 in the service of King Philip II of Spain, charged with recording the places that Philip himself had visited when he'd come to England to marry the English Queen, Mary Tudor. And here is the fine view of Richmond from that group of drawings in the Ashmolean. As you can see from the measurements there, these are big sheets, these are big, substantial drawings, and really very splendid. Just a few years later than this, another Flemish artist came and recorded views in England, Joris Hoefnagel, who made the drawings on which the 9 views of English cities that were included in Brown and Hogenberg's crucial topographical publication Civitatis Orbis Terrarum were based. This drawing of 1568 is a first view of Windsor, rather elaborate drawing with quite a bit of action and foreground figurage going on. He then simplified the composition somewhat and combined it with his view of Oxford in another drawing, also in the smaller drawing in the Royal Collection, which then served as the basis for the published print issued in 1575. If we move on into the earlier 17th century, there's a small group of Dutch and Flemish artists, not all of whom are really very well known in their native land, who produced fascinating original landscapes and topographical works in England, with relatively few parallels in what either they or their contemporaries did back at home. One of them is Alexander Kierings, who was in England from 1637 to 1641 and was commissioned by the king to paint 10 views of royal palaces and castles in England and Scotland, of which this spectacular large painting of Pontefract Castle, long destroyed, is one of the more interesting. completely different type of compositions from what Kerinx made when he was back in Flanders. Sadly, there are no drawings by Kerinx that we can associate with his English period. And sadly, the same is also true of the artist with whom he shared a studio in London, Cornelis van Poelenburg. It's also worth mentioning here another artist, Cornelis Bol, who was in England from 1636 until sometime before 1642, when he's back in Haarlem. We know very little from the hand of Bol, but he did paint a series of extremely fine views of the Thames and London landmarks, a commission that he received from the diarist John Evelyn. And these paintings he continued to repeat. There are several versions of the paintings also by his own hand, including this one in the Dulwich Picture Gallery, showing Arundel House here on the right, and then further upriver towards Westminster, Whitehall and Westminster. This is a slightly later repetition. Drawings? Well, there's one drawing that's been attributed to him, but mainly I think on the basis of the fact that it's signed with the initials CB and it depicts a view of a location on the Thames. It could be by him, we can't be sure, but there's not really much to tell us what Bol actually did when he was in England. Those paintings sort of stand out in a way as exceptional oddities within his work. It's a fascinating thing. This is even more true of another artist who visited England, Claude de Jong, author of this extraordinary painting now at Kenwood House, The View of Old London Bridge of 1630, his absolute masterpiece, of which he made 2 or 3 more versions over the following 20 years. The Kenwood painting is based on a drawing of 1627 in the Guildhall Library in London, and de Jong was in England from then, probably until about 1630. Otherwise, we have a small group of drawings by him which are supposed to depict locations in Kent, although there's nothing that can be identified with any absolute certainty. Some of these are dated 1627, some 1628. They look a bit more like the drawings you would have expected to come from the hand of a Haarlem artist. But that's it. There are hardly any other paintings or drawings. Why? How can it be? How can an artist who produced really relatively little have produced that extraordinary masterpiece of the Old London Bridge painting? Well, it may possibly be the question of partial survival that I mentioned before, but also in this case we know a little bit more because Martin Jan Bock made an archival discovery some years ago that the artist Claude de Jong was sorely incapacitated in his arms in old age. So that's some sort of explanation, but still it's a bit of a surprise. That painting sort of comes out of nowhere in a way. And that's true of so many of the artists who visited England. One important question that we really should ask ourselves is, were there also during this period anonymous, non-specific landscapes being painted in England similar to those in Holland, alongside topographically specific compositions by artists such as Cuyp or Van Gooyen or Ruysdael? It's slightly difficult because obviously by definition it's rather hard to know when where exactly a non-topographical landscape was drawn or painted. But all the same, in essence, the answer seems to be not really, not at this point anyway. The philosophical principle that underpins quite a lot of Dutch landscape of the second quarter of the 17th century, namely that the smallest, most seemingly mundane or anonymous corner of the Dutch countryside is actually a noble subject worthy of a painter's attention, seems not to have been in evidence in Britain at this time, which is actually perfectly understandable given the difference in the political history of the two countries. The emphasis on topography that we see in art produced in England also extends to the works of the major artists who came to England at this time. For example, Rubens. And here we have in his grand landscape with St. George and the Dragon, a sort of South Bank Capriccio on the far side of the river, with various London landmark buildings dotted around on the shore there, with the purpose of locating this painting very clearly as English in subject, and the figure of St. George identifying him as the king. But this sort of approach with topographical detail is extremely unusual in a Rubens allegory of this type. Equally, Van Dyck leaves us in no doubt about where he is, or rather where his subject is. In the great piece, the portrait of Charles I and Henrietta Maria with their children, we have a clear depiction of the Palace of Westminster in the background in a way that's rather unusual in a Van Dyck portrait. Topographical elements like that in the Van Dyck painting must have been based on a drawing or drawings. And if the drawing was by Van Dyck himself rather than a studio assistant, it would probably have been a precise pen and ink study, rather like this view of Antwerp in the Brussels Royal Library, or for that matter, the Morgan's own drawing of Rye, one of the 5 drawings that Van Dyck has left us of views of this English south coast port city, a town which he seems to have drawn when he was stuck there waiting for a boat. But these few topographical drawings, the Rye views and the Antwerp one, are really all that we have of that type by Van Dyck. What else among the small number of surviving landscape drawings by him could reasonably be thought to have been made in England? What do we have in the way of drawings by Van Dyck at all? Well, we have several pen drawings, technically similar to the Rye view, for example, but less specific in terms of their topography. Well, it could be an English view. It doesn't have to be. I don't think we can be sure either way. Then we have 1 or 2 drawings where the pen work is worked up with a certain amount of coloured wash or watercolour, such as this one in the British Museum. Here we have a good reason to think that this was made in England, because the same tree that we see in the middle of this watercolour drawing here appears very, very clearly in the grand portrait of Charles I on horseback in the National Gallery. And finally, if we're talking about Van Dyck's landscapes, we cannot pass over the extraordinary small group of very freely executed watercolours, including this one in the Getty, which are so ahead of their time in so many ways and sort of anticipate what is going to happen in England in the art of watercolour painting nearly a century later. Are they English in origins? There are some loose connections with paintings that suggest they might be. There's the aspect of influence on later artists that we would like to see in them, but we can't be absolutely sure. So it doesn't really all add up to a huge amount of evidence as to what Van Dyck did in the way of drawings when he was in England. It is, though, much, much more than we have for another significant artist dear to my heart who came to England from his native Leiden in 1632, apparently to work in Van Dyck's studio, namely Jan Lievens. Lievens stayed in London for 3 years, 1632 to 35, but we have extremely few drawings or paintings that can reasonably be associated with this time in his career. There's a small number of figure drawings and studies, portrait-type studies, including Chips's marvellous full-length study of a gentleman, which, together with the very similarly executed drawings in Düsseldorf, does seem to date from his English period. And in addition to that, we have precisely one landscape made by Lievens in England, this view of London in the House of Lords Library. Otherwise, all that there is that one could even mention are a pen and figure drawing that's supposed to be a portrait of Charles I, and a black chalk drawing in Frankfurt, which has got an inscription on the back that says, Jan Lievens de Oude buiten Londen na het leven getekend. Jan Lievens the Elder, drawn from life outside London. Well, You might not know either of those things if you didn't have that inscription on the back. So we, again, have to put that with a big question mark. But you can see there's not much to go on to account for 3 years of Lievens' life in London. The artist who has actually left us the largest body of drawings of mid-17th century London, and also many other English locations, was one who never painted but was immensely influential as a printmaker, namely Wenceslaus Holler. And I'm sorry for the slightly disturbing scale of this image. The drawing, which is this big, is about 150 times actual size here, but it holds up very well. It's the mark of a good drawing. Holler was brought to England by the Earl of Arundel in 1636 and remained there for most of the rest of his life, and made numerous drawings and prints of London views in particular, which are a vital record of the appearance and topography of the city, particularly given what was to come in the way of destruction in the following years, both from the Civil War and from the Great Fire of London. We really wouldn't know much about what Old St. Paul's Cathedral looked like in detail, were it not for Holler. I know he's not, strictly speaking, Dutch and Flemish, but can we please just stretch the point a little bit here? And actually, let's stretch the point again for another important artist who came to England at about the same time, around 1643, Peter Lely, again represented with this splendid drawing upstairs in the Moore Collection exhibition. Why, you are obviously wondering, am I mentioning Lely in a talk about landscape? Well, that's because there is actually one rather wonderful drawing in the British Museum, signed and dated by Lely, 1643, probably the year he came to England. And obviously we don't know whether it was made before or after he came to England, and we can't tell whether it's an English view or not. But the sheer fact that an artist as influential and significant as Lely was making landscape drawings of this type would, I think, be of considerable significance for the artists who came into contact with him after he came to England. So far we've talked exclusively about the earlier Tudor-Stuart period and the Civil War period, Protectorate and Commonwealth. After the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, things changed rather a lot. Yes, the sort of royal patronage that had existed prior to the Civil War returned, but it was in a much less extensive and lavish form. And there was, crucially, much more input from what I don't want to call them minor aristocrats, but a wider range of the aristocracy, and also other areas of society, the merchant classes, and so on. In addition to which, many of the royalists had been in exile in the Netherlands. And so there was a greater convergence of taste, as it were, between the two countries than there had been before. And there was also, despite 3 Anglo-Dutch wars in the second half of the 17th century, greater ease of movement and exchange. In fact, some of the artists who made the largest numbers of drawings of English views in the second half of the century actually worked for Dutch patrons, and one in particular, the Amsterdam merchant Laurens van der Hem. Van der Hem famously amassed an enormous number of drawings, both commissioned and bought on the open market, to interleave into his copy of Blau's World Atlas, extending the original 11 volumes of the printed atlas to no fewer than 50 volumes, and this amazing corpus of topographical material is now in the Austrian National Library in Vienna. The Atlas van der Hem includes 57 views of England, most of them made by 2 artists whose names we've already heard, Jacob Esselens and Willem Schellings. Esselens was in England in 1665-6, and typically he made, as Stein has described, sketchy drawings on the spot, which were then elaborated into more or less accurate finished works for inclusion in the Atlas van der Hem and for sale as separate items. Here we have his drawing, rapid chalk drawing of Chatham, and there we see the finished worked up drawing based on the sketchy drawing, the larger drawing now in the Atlas van der Hem. Some of the drawings in the Atlas are absolutely enormous, And they were also made in repetitions for sale to other patrons because they were such special things. Here we have a variation of Esselens' view of Canterbury, as you see, over 1 metre wide, which is now in the British Museum. Schellinck's was in England slightly earlier, 1661 to 63, and as Stein mentioned, he kept diaries of all his travels, though I actually have found those diaries massively frustrating. When I discovered he'd written detailed diaries, I thought it was going to be a wonderful resource and we'd be able to read there exactly who he met and what artists he came into contact with and what patrons he encountered and what artworks he saw. Nothing of the sort. It tells us where he went, on which day, which is kind of useful because it means you can date drawings very accurately. And then after that, basically all he put in his diary was what he'd eaten every day. So I was cross with it after I'd read it all. While he was in England, Schellinck stayed for quite a while at this house, which is Bridge Place in Kent, the house of Sir Arnold Brahms, a Dutch merchant who lived in England. And this is typical of the sort of sketchy views that he made and which he then elaborated into grand finished drawings such as, and I put this in honor of Stein's last slide, you'd think this is a double act, wouldn't you? The view of Exeter from the Atlas van der Hem, which again, I hate to go on about this, but 1 metre 42 centimetres wide. This is an enormous great thing. Schellinck used his English views and the information that he'd gathered while he was there, not only for these big Van der Hem sheets, but also whenever was relevant and useful later on. And an event that provided him with important subject matter took place a couple of years after he arrived. He went home again from England, namely in June 1667, when the Dutch fleet in the Second Anglo-Dutch War sailed audaciously up the Thames estuary into the River Medway and burned the heck out of the English fleet where they were at anchor. And this was a celebrated event. Schellinck happily made a big drawing based on his own observations when he was there, recording the layout of the battle and the burning of the fleet, and then actually made a number of paintings repeating this subject, of which the Dutch were extremely proud. There are several versions of this. Actually, they're still proud of it today. I once went to an event at the Dutch Embassy in London, and when the ambassador found out what I did for a living, he beckoned me sort of conspiratorially into his office and pointed above his desk where was proudly hanging another version of this painting. Dutch diplomacy at its finest. Other widely travelled artists, and I shouldn't actually forget, there is the third artist who contributed to the Atlas van der Hem English volumes was none other than Lambert Domer, about whom we've heard a lot. But as Stein mentioned, he just passed by the Isle of Wight when he was on his way to France. And so what we have in the Atlas van der Hem is a series of small number of drawings just of views on the Isle of Wight, and these drawings are also found elsewhere, such as this one in the British Museum, given to the British Museum some years ago by our friend George Abrams, who is indeed here with us. Other widely travelled artists, also like Schellinck and Esselens, visited England in the 1660s, and one is actually, though not a major artist, interesting and worth mentioning here, the author of these 3 English views and of many others like them, of locations not only in England but also in France, Italy, Switzerland and elsewhere. These very characteristic drawings executed in particular, some have sometimes said Rembrandt-esque, pen and wash technique, or often on coloured paper grounds and always inscribed in the same way with the location depicted up at the top. The one at the bottom is a particularly lovely one, a set of 4 views of St. James's Park that recently came to light. We don't know who these drawings would have been made for. Perhaps they were made for a patron, perhaps they weren't. We also don't really know who the artist is. Some of them bear initials on the back in red chalk, MVO, and on the basis of that they've been attributed to Michiel van Overbeek, nephew of topographical draftsman Bonaventura van Overbeek, but there's no real way to be sure about this. So the activities of these various visiting artists of the 1660s highlight the fact that after the Restoration, the flow to England of Dutch, as opposed to Flemish artists, and of landscapists increased considerably. There's statistical basis for this. Of the 33 or 34 artists from the Netherlands who are known to have worked in England in the 1630s, only about 8 or 9 of them produced any landscapes. In other words, less than a quarter, and most of those artists were Flemish. But in the 1660s, the numbers are 21 out of 37 visitors making landscapes. In other words, nearly 2/3, and most of those artists were Dutch. And that's an interesting development and progression. The perfect expression of this tendency is the group of artists that would generally get referred to as the Ham House group. These artists were hired by the Duke and Duchess of Lauderdale in connection with the extensive refurbishment that they undertook of their seat of Ham House, now just outside London, which followed their wedding in 1672. Who did the Lauderdales turn to for this job? Mainly artists and craftsmen who they knew from their time in exile in Holland, and many of those were landscape specialists. Among the artists who came to England during this period and who did interesting landscape drawings there were some who are very well represented in the exhibition upstairs. Thomas Wijk. Chips's drawing is, of course, not of an English view. Even I know that. But he did also depict London in a very similar way, and the atmosphere and the rather Italianate light in Wijk's London views is very distinctive. It could almost be the banks of the Tiber. It's actually the north side of the Thames with the old water tower and old St. Paul's round to the right. And Wijk's records of London views between the period of 1663 to 6 are actually very important. Wijk stayed through the Great Fire, made a drawing of Newgate Prison blazing away in the middle of it, and also made drawings of old St. Paul's and the ruins of St. Paul's after the fire, which looked for all the world like the ruins of ancient Rome. His son Jan Wijk was also in London, and this grand panoramic London view from Blackheath down over London has sometimes been attributed to him. Topographical evidence tells us it has to have been made no later than 1669, when Jan Wijk would have been 17 years old. So the attribution has to remain slightly doubt as questionable. But what we know that he did do was this extremely interesting drawing of a race meeting on the heath at Newmarket, which is actually one of the very first depictions of horse racing in English art, something that was to become obviously such a national obsession. The later 17th century also saw a resurgence of interest in topographical drawings and paintings of palaces and country houses, like the first drawings that we saw today. But by now, the subjects of these drawings were no longer exclusively royal palaces. Patronage, as we said, was extending through a wider spectrum of society. And so we find drawings of all sorts of country houses. A good example of an artist working in this genre is Hendrik Dankerts, who worked at Ham and also elsewhere. This drawing, recently acquired by Cleveland, is an interesting example of one of his classic large views of a country house, as is the British Museum's view of Badminton House. I would ask you to look at one aspect of this badminton drawing, and that is the viewpoint. There's a sort of feeling that he's gradually creeping up. He's starting to look more from above down onto the subject matter. And that is the beginning of a tendency in late 17th century English topographical drawing, which was to become really quite a strong theme. Until the point where late in the century and at the beginning of the 18th century, we have a complete tradition of the bird's eye view of country houses that has become very well established. This is a very typical example by Leendert Knijf relating to his great publication, Britannia Illustrata, an engraved series of views of English country houses and palaces, all seen in this bird's eye view, which was published between 1707 and 1709. One of the most distinguished practitioners of this genre, at least in paintings, was another artist dear to my heart, Jan Sieberechts. And this painting of Woollerton Hall, home of his great patron Thomas Willoughby, is a very typical example of his paintings of that type. But interestingly, Sieberechts does not seem to have made drawings of this type at all. The relatively small number of landscape drawings that we have by him are different in character. They're much more naturalistic, much more down to earth. This has a highish viewpoint and a panoramic view, but that's because he's on a hillside in a deep valley. This is one of the wonderful group of watercolours that Sieberechts made in the area around Chatsworth in Derbyshire, where he worked in the 1690s. And we should not, of course, overlook or ignore the drawing that adorns the cover of the Moore collection catalogue, his view of Oxford, this wonderfully free and expansive view of Oxford with this even more freely executed river landscape on the verso. The view of Oxford, I have to say, as Stein described, is slightly, not totally topographically accurate, but it's still very definitely identifiable as Oxford. In these sorts of watercolours, like the Chatsworth, the Derbyshire view and these, Sieberechts is picking up in a way where Van Dyck left off half a century earlier, and is exploring the potential of watercolour in landscape in a way that really does open the door to the great British speciality of the 18th century. And finally, you'll be pleased to hear, no discussion of Dutch and Flemish artists working in 17th century Britain can be considered complete without a mention of the Van der Veldes. Willem van der Velde the Elder came to England in 1672, end of 72, beginning of 73. He followed soon after by his son. They had had successful careers, of course, in the Netherlands, but politics and economics caused by wars led them to seek to work elsewhere. And they found an extremely enthusiastic patron in England in Charles II. And the two artists, as we all know very well, spent the rest of their lives as sort of embedded war correspondents with the British Navy, recording the battles with their own countrymen, and also as the great documenters of every aspect of marine life and the activity of the waterways of Britain. These drawings are, as we know, cross-category. They're not only documenting naval activities, they're also landscapes, they're documenting historical events. This, of course, is the drawing upstairs now, the great view of the moment when the king went down the river to Woolwich to inspect the newly refurbished ship, the Tiger, in 1681, a particularly splendid example of this sort of documentary marine drawing by Van der Velde. And it's a great, it's wonderful that in the collection alongside that you have the actual portrait of the ship itself, the Tiger, which is a wonderful thing to see side by side. It sort of encapsulates aspects of the Van der Velde's output. They also made other categories of drawings, and I'll just show you two as typical examples, although this isn't so typical. This is one of a series of drawings that Van der Velde made as designs for tapestries, recording the course of the Battle of Lowestoft of 1665, the exact events that happened at each moment in the battle. And these grand drawings were made. There are three of them of the Battle of Lowestoft and others relating to other battles. And finally, a landscape. This is, I think, this rather wonderfully atmospheric drawing is probably as close to a pure landscape by Van der Velde as you're ever likely to see. I just wanted to show it to justify my inclusion of him in a lecture about landscape. So, Dutch artists came to England in unprecedented numbers in the 17th century. Actually, in the end, we even got not just an artist, but we got our king from Holland. This is the monument erected at the place in Devon where King William III, William of Orange, landed with I think the only inscription in Dutch on a public sculpture in England. So there was quite a lot of Dutch influence. Dutch, it says, English freedom secured by Orange. So it's not shy. But why did all these Dutch and Flemish artists come to England? Well, if you actually go back to the treatises that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, you would believe that all the artists who came to England were either failures back at home, or they were fleeing prosecution for crimes, or in some cases, running away from cuckolded husbands with whose wives they'd had affairs. These sort of seem to be the main themes in the treatises explaining their trip to England, but that obviously was not really the reason. There's a huge mixture of factors. External factors such as the politics in times of war with all the fluctuations of the political events, the religious tensions, some artists were Catholics, some were Protestants, which meant that some needed to be in one place and some in another. The economics of the time, the downturn post the battles with the French of the 1670s that drove the Van der Veldes to England, all these things played part. But in the end, the main factor was the actual demand for their works that existed in England. They wouldn't have gone there if there hadn't been a market there wanting their works. In the earlier part of the period, we're looking primarily at a royal desire to attract as many important artists as possible to England. After the Restoration and the return of the exiles, you have a broadening of the art market and patronage. But whatever the reasons were for their coming, come they did, leaving us with a varied and fascinating body of landscape drawings. Thanks to the inevitably erratic survival of drawings, the works that we have today are surely only part of the whole story. But all the same, they do add up to an intriguing corpus, often of great beauty, the essentials of which I have tried to sketch out for you today.